Thank you all for coming. I'm Dr. Rankin Sherling. I'm the Associate Director of the Declaration of Independence Center for the Study of American Freedom. We would like to thank you, all of our students. We've made it through a long year here. This is the last of our major speaker series. We do have some more symposia left coming up, but the Declaration of Independence Center is devoted to the study of American freedom, and most of our classes are designed to revolve around the founding documents. We believe that preserving American traditions is of vital importance, and we are very happy to have Professor Stephen Hayward here, and his work does all of those things. Before we introduce Dr. Hayward, though, I'd like to introduce Mr. Alexander Norton, who's from the National Review Institute, who will tell us about the Buckley project, and then introduce Professor Hayward.
Hey everybody, I'm Alexander Norton III. I'm originally from Las Vegas, Nevada, but now live in New York, working for National Review Institute, the 501c3 parent organization of National Review, the magazine. We all work as one organization, so there's not much of a difference between us. It's just that we plan events through the Institute, and we also host development events and fundraisers for the magazine. So getting started, National Review Institute, as I said, is the 501c3 founded by William F. Buckley Jr. in 1991. Our mission is to preserve and promote Buckley's legacy, support the NR magazine's mission, and advance the principles of a free society through educational and outreach programs. What is the magazine's mission, you may ask? It is to defend and advance the ordered liberty that is necessary for human flourishing and to a free, prosperous, and strong America. So 10 years ago, we launched the Buckley Legacy Project to make William F. Buckley Jr.'s work on relevant topics accessible to our supporters, donors, friends, and allies within the conservative movement, and most importantly, to a new generation of conservatives. This year is Buckley's centennial, and we have compiled signature partnership events, including tonight's on-campus lecture, and to capture Buckley's legacy to influence the next generation. Because this year is his centennial, we recently issued a new book of essays, Knight Errant, on the enduring legacy of Buckley. Any of you who are interested can speak to me after this event to order a copy. Additionally, we unveiled our special centennial website that includes a full timeline of notable moments in Buckley's life, and it serves as a unique resource to those researching him. We will also make the magazine's archives available online free of charge by the end of the year. Any students can take advantage of a complimentary one-year digital subscription with their institutional email accounts. To commemorate Buckley's centennial, Dr. Stephen Hayward will impart upon us some wisdom. He's a fellow, let me get the correct bio here. Dr. Stephen Hayward currently is the Edward Gaylord Distinguished Visiting Professor at Pepperdine University's School of Public Policy, and he's a fellow of the Public Law and Policy Program at UC Berkeley School of Law. From 2002 to 2012, he was the F.K. Weyerhaeuser Fellow in Law and Economics at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and he has been Senior Fellow at the Pacific Research Institute in San Francisco since 1991. He writes frequently for the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, New York Post, Washington Post, National Review, the Washington Examiner, the Claremont Review of Books, and other publications. The author of 10 books, including a 2-volume chronicle of Ronald Reagan and his times entitled The Age of Reagan, The Fall of the Old Liberal Order, 1964 to 1980, and The Age of Reagan, The Conservative Counterrevolution, from 1980 to 1989, and also The Almanac of Environmental Trends, Patriotism is Not Enough, Harry Jaffa, Walter Berns, and the Arguments That Redefined American Conservatism. His most recent book is M. Stanton Evans, Conservative Wit, Apostle of Freedom. He writes almost daily on the Political Questions Substack. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Stephen Hayward.
Thanks. Oh, I don't need that. I got to turn it on, don't I? I'll do that. Hold on. I've got to get all the electronics right. Though I'm not sure if my booming voice are necessary. Okay, everyone should hear me clearly now. And okay. It's really a thrill to be visiting Oxford, Mississippi. I've never been before, and I should have a long time ago, because I have this very peculiar relic that I've showed a few people, and I can show you a picture afterwards. Some years ago, my wife was looking through eBay or Craigslist or somewhere, I don't know, trying to get some couch pillows and maybe some throw rugs or something, and she came across an Ole Miss, square pillow like you'd have at the end of a couch, an Ole Miss color Ole Miss Rebels, except there's a typo. It said Ole Miss Rebeless, R-E-B-L-E-S. By the way, it's a very high quality pillow. There's no tag on it, so I don't know if it was made in China and somebody was dyslexic or what, but how do you make a typo on a pillow? And it's now one of our favorite relics, and we commented on it often about go Rebeless, go Ole Miss Rebeless, right? And it's also a wonderful privilege, Alexander, to have been invited by the community at National Review to participate in its Buckley Legacy Project and the centennial of his birth. I started reading National Review, I think I figured it out in the 8th grade, which is ridiculous. I did get to tell Buckley that once, and he said I wasn't the youngest reader he'd ever heard of reading the magazine, but close to it. And he thought, I'm sure, that there's something wrong with somebody with a misspent youth like that. So I set out a bold claim. My title is The Pen is Mightier. Subtitle's a little more anodyne about the literary political impact of Buckley, but the abstract I gave to the center here was that the more I thought about it, the more I think Buckley is the most influential journalist or literary figure in American history, full stop. You might think if you asked that question, it would be Mark Twain or Walt Whitman. But I think there's a reason why Buckley deserves to be considered number one. Now, beyond his own writing and his work as an editor, TV host, behind-the-scenes activist, as I'll explain in a moment, I think you pick all those together, and historical figures tend to disappear after a while. And of course, for a younger generation, Buckley's been gone almost 20 years now, and so he's another figure that disappears into the woodwork or into the wallpaper of our time. And that claim depends on more than just his writing, because to call him put forward this bold thesis I just have, you really have to put in a lot of the collateral aspects that I've already mentioned. But rather than presenting a potted biography, that would get tedious pretty fast, I think. I want to treat him this way. I want to propose 8 ways of thinking about Buckley. I could do more than 8, but I'm going to confine myself to 8, that I hope can give some insight into his man and his times, but also some aspects of his life and career and writing as an example that can last, and perhaps some of us might try to emulate. It is necessary to do a little bit of the context of his arrival on the American scene and why he was something fresh and brand new, and why he became the first famous conservative thinker and indeed public celebrity. We never had anybody like him before. There had been some capable conservative writers and activists before Buckley, as far back as the 1920s or even earlier, but they tended to be obscure to the general public, and with few exceptions, mostly bland in their writing. I mean, who reads Irving Babbitt much anymore, or Paul Elmer More, or other people that most of you probably have never heard of? And the other thing was, people even like Albert J. Nock, who was a very colorful writer and a mentor to Buckley as a young man. He was an interesting writer, but he was very non-political. By that is, he just hated politics, didn't vote, thought it was a waste of time to vote. And so people like Albert J. Nock and others were eccentric and more nostalgic than combative. A lot of that older traditional conservatives were pining for a lost world of chivalry and aristocratic privilege, and the thought of rolling up their sleeves and engaging in the grubby world of politics or controversies on current issues, that was just a too grubby and down-market a thing to do. There were very few conservative political organizations of any kind, and the ones that did exist were small, marginal, cranky, and mostly protest groups with little plan or energy for actual political competition. And at the time Buckley came to adulthood, around 1950, that's when he graduates from Yale, There was no conservative movement beyond a single figure, and it was Robert A. Taft, the longtime senator from Ohio, two-time presidential candidate, unsuccessful both times, and he was known as Mr. Conservative. Now, Taft was a very formidable person. Milton Friedman once told me that Taft was the single smartest politician he ever met. And Friedman met a lot of them, starting with Franklin Roosevelt and going all the way through both of the Presidents Bush. But it was clear by the early 1950s that Taft represented a distinct minority inside the Republican Party even, which meant he was a minority of a minority. And it was also evident to people like Buckley and others that the Republican Party as a whole was firmly in the control of an establishment that was only slightly less liberal than the Democrats who had given us the New Deal. Now, there's a famous quote from the literary critic Lionel Trilling in his 1950 classic, The Liberal Imagination. It gets cited in every history of the period, but I would be remiss if I didn't recall it again once more here, especially for those few who may not have heard it. It goes as follows. He said at the beginning of that book, "It is the plain fact that nowadays there are no conservative or reactionary ideas in general circulation. The conservative impulse and the reactionary impulse do not, with some isolated and some ecclesiastical exceptions, express themselves in ideas, but only in action or in irritable mental gestures which seek to resemble ideas." End of that quote. You can find similar dismissive sentiments toward conservatives or conservatism from another leading book by a prominent liberal of the time, Arthur Schlesinger's book, The Vital Center. A lot of that book, by the way, is criticizing certain radical elements among liberalism and even some criticisms of the old progressives of the teens and 20s. But about conservatism, he said there's really nothing here to even think about. And so the mid-century, to put it in one sentence, was a great time for liberals and liberalism. I should hasten to add, though, that Trilling was not himself hostile to conservative ideas. In fact, the liberal imagination, still very much worth reading today, I think, was meant as a warning to his fellow liberals to be more self-critical. Today, I think his book would be considered almost a conservative book. I think conservatives like that book more than liberals do today. And that is more of a reflection on the ideological ruin most universities have made of English literature and criticism today, but that's a subject for another occasion. So following some time in uniform in World War II, and briefly with the early CIA, Buckley finally came to Yale University in 1946. He was supremely well prepared for an Ivy League education, having been brought up in a wealthy, conservative Catholic family that included much private tutoring and boarding school in both the US and Britain. And at Yale, he cut quite a dashing figure, becoming editor of the Yale Daily News, surely on his talent alone, not his opinions, and a leading debater. And it was clear he was destined for great things. What Yale did not expect is that his debut on the national scene would come in the form of a surprise bestseller that was an attack on Yale for its leftism. God and Man at Yale, it was called, and it was a book ahead of its time with its harsh criticisms of growing ideological monoculture, faculty bias in the classroom, and a degraded curriculum. Today, this kind of criticism sounds very familiar about our colleges and universities. And today, it almost summons a yawn to make this argument. At the time, though, as I say, it created a sensation. The left-leaning critic Dwight MacDonald, a prominent figure in those days, wrote that Yale reacted with all the grace and agility of an elephant cornered by a mouse. The longest reply that Yale suggested was its official reply came from McGeorge Bundy, then president of the Ford Foundation and later national security advisor to Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, and a key architect of our fabulously successful strategy in the Vietnam War. He wrote a very long attack on Buckley's book in The Atlantic. So clearly, Buckley had gotten everyone's attention. Now, he noted that Yale began, as nearly all of America's oldest colleges had, as an explicitly Christian institution, intended primarily to train clergy. And so Buckley's most famous statement in the book was this, in the opening pages of it. Quote, I myself believe that the duel between Christianity and atheism is the most important in the world. I further believe that the struggle between individualism and collectivism is the same struggle reproduced on another level. Now, eventually this first work led to one of Buckley's most famous aphorisms that is often recalled. Years later, he said he would rather be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston telephone directory than by the faculty of Harvard University. Today, I expect if Buckley were with us, he'd look at the university scene and say he would prefer to be educated by the first 2,000 first 2,000 names in the Boston phone book than the faculty of Harvard University, and there we are. In any case, there's an interesting detail in the previous quotation of the book I just shared that can slip by quickly if you're not paying very close attention or don't know the whole book. There he used the term individualism, right? He said the duel between, the struggle between individualism and collectivism is the same struggle reproduced on another level. Individualism is here a stand-in, of course, for free market capitalism, just as collectivism is a synonym for socialism. But it is significant that you do not find the word conservative in the book. And Buckley didn't use that term, and he didn't describe himself that way. In those days, he referred to himself as an individualist. And I think partly this reflects the influence on him from two of his early mentors. I already mentioned Albert J. Nock, who was a frequent guest at his parents' house. The other was a now forgotten figure named Frank Chodorov. He was a very articulate and formidable anti-statist who championed individualism. He also abjured the label conservative, at one point saying, anyone who calls me a conservative gets a punch in the nose. So you can see a little bit where Buckley got it from. But by degrees, however, Buckley came to the view that conservative was a better label because it captured a broader spectrum of complementary ideas. And what he thought the conservative movement needed was a prominent magazine to serve as a rally point for writers and thinkers to begin contesting in a serious way the dominant intellectual and political culture of the time. And thus, National Review was born in 1955 with Buckley as the editor-in-chief at the impossibly young age of 30. Now, the paradox to keep in mind for this moment is that for liberals, America in the 1950s was already conservative. And that, for liberals, was precisely the problem. Between a conformist culture as exciting as cold mashed potatoes, so they thought, a sluggish economy, and an uninspiring and unimaginative President Eisenhower, liberals thought the nation was underperforming, so to speak. Now, for Buckley and other conservatives, the nation's anti-communism was weak, faltering, and ineffective, and Eisenhower and the Republican Party faulted for not contesting, let alone trying to roll back the New Deal. People like to say today that we suffer from deep political polarization, and there's considerable nostalgia across the political spectrum these days for the more placid times of the 1950s, we think. But in fact, the roots of today's divisions, I think, can be seen taking shape back in that decade. And so the famous mission statement, some of you may know it from the first issue of National Review, sounds quite radical. It said, the purpose of the magazine is to stand athwart history, yelling, stop. He capitalized stop, at a time when no one is inclined to do so or to have much patience with those who so urge it. Now, you can argue pro and con the proposition that the stop sign Buckley and conservatism set out was simply run over by the secular advance of the left since 1955 in politics, policy, and culture. We can take that up perhaps during the question and discussion period in a few minutes. But there's one other paragraph from that founding mission statement that I think you will hear. I'm not sure if an old statement has an echo, but you will sound some familiar notes today, I think. Quote him again. Conservatives in this country, at least those who have not made their peace with the New Deal, and there is serious question whether there are others, are non-licensed nonconformists. And this is a dangerous business in the liberal world. Radical conservatives, that's not a phrase you often put together, radical and conservative, right? Radical conservatives in this country have an interesting time of it. For when they are not being suppressed or mutilated by the liberals, they are being ignored or humiliated by a great many of those on the well-fed right whose ignorance and amorality have never been exaggerated for the same reason that one cannot exaggerate infinity. If you follow some of the contemporary debates and some of the restive, especially younger people today, they like to talk about the well-fed right or Conservatism, Inc., and they say it's corrupt, it hasn't succeeded in doing anything, and we don't need them anymore. I usually say I resemble that remark. It's because of my age group, I suppose. So pin that for a moment, and we can talk about it some more, but there are a number of people, sort of populist conservatives today, important parts of President Trump's base, who have warm feelings for the New Deal. The New Deal is not something to be attacked and rolled back, but celebrated and emulated. I could go through some of the names of that if you want. And they use that same phrase about the well-fed right. Ceteris paribus, as Buckley liked to say. What goes around comes around. Now, I said near the outset that the best way to comprehend Buckley as the most significant journalist in our history is to consider 8 aspects of his character and thought and action, some of which overlap. And I think they are an example of the old and stale cliche that the total is greater than the sum of its parts, and that's certainly and emphatically the case with Buckley. So he was first much more than a journalist. He was, to use a phrase from the 50s, an organization man. So the reason he can be said to be the most influential conservative of the second half of the 20th century is that he was the catalyst for a lot of practical political activism, sometimes indirectly behind the scenes, sometimes front and center. For example, hosting the founding of the Young Americans for Freedom at his estate in Connecticut in 1961. He helped to found numerous smaller organizations and some important conservative intellectual organizations like the Philadelphia Society, which met just last weekend in Dallas for its 60th year. If there was a cause or a new organization that needed standing up, everyone understood you'd like to get Buckley's help or blessing. And if you asked for his help, he almost always said yes. Sometimes he would even loan small sums of money. I'll come back to that point to some of these organizations and people. But the point is everyone back from that era has a story or a Buckley connection of some kind. The second thing about him was his personality and style. He was the ultimate happy warrior, with an impish smile and flashing eyes, almost unfailingly cheerful. More on that in a moment. But he was also rather exotic. I like to say he spoke with an accent of no known country on the planet. The best I can do is say it was a combination of southern New England patrician leavened with maybe 10 days at a British boarding school. It might be possible to make it out as the effect of having learned English as his second language. He had a Spanish nanny or governess as a young boy, and so he learned Spanish as his first language. So I don't know if that explains it a little bit or not, but it's an interesting little fact about him. There was a fun part about Buckley. One time he was on the, I'll say more about this a little bit later on, he was on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, which he appeared on many, many times, back when it had huge ratings because it was the only late night show. And at the opening monologue where Johnny Carson used to tell who the guests were coming that night, he says, well, we have the writer and columnist William F. Buckley Jr., and for those who don't understand him, we'll have a simulcast in English. The audience laughs. He comes out and sits down and immediately begins speaking to Johnny Carson in Spanish. This is great fun. Audience broke up, of course. Now, despite his aristocratic upbringing and bearing, in his long-running TV show Firing Line, he slouched noticeably in his chair, his hair often poorly combed and his suit often visibly wrinkled. He often seemed to affect a pose of boredom, except he was highly attentive to his guests and ready to pounce quickly on any contestable point that he thought would make for a lively and interesting show. I don't know how many of you have ever tried to watch any old episodes of Firing Line. I recommend you try it. I think it looks very, what do you say? I think younger people today find it incomprehensible that you'd have an hour-long show where the camera didn't move around. It didn't have the brightly lit sets like you have in the TV shows today. Sustained argument and at a slow pace. And of course, we now take in things like 6-minute segments on cable TV news or TikTok and so forth. All of these tactics are designed to keep you from pressing the change button on your remote control. But it shows, that saying that our attention spans have changed is not news, of course. Third, A crucial element of his personality and style I've already hinted at, but it deserves its own separate enumeration, was his legendary humor and quick wit. There are countless examples of this. You could talk for hours about his best witticisms in person and in his writing. Two of my favorite examples are just from one source. It was his Playboy magazine interview in 1970. Of course, he disapproved of Hugh Hefner and the Playboy philosophy and so forth for typical conservative reasons. So the first question he was asked was, why did you agree to sit for an interview with Playboy? His answer was, because I calculate that it is the best way to communicate with my teenage son. A little later on, they're going through a checklist of issues, and the interviewer asked him, what should be done about the problem of overpopulation? High on our minds in 1970. His one sentence, he shot back, get people to stop reading Playboy. So he was quick that way and spontaneous. Once again, I think there's a sharp contrast between Buckley and other conservatives who came before him and after him, many of whom seldom displayed much wit or humor, except in the case of Albert J. Knox, some pretty good sarcasm here and there, which can be an effective but limited form of wit. But every time I see Jordan Peterson today, who's this towering figure right now, but he always seems to have the look of an oncologist about to deliver a grim diagnosis to a patient, and I can't ever remember him telling a joke. But with Buckley, even his liberal opponents couldn't help but laugh at his witticisms, often when they were the target of them. It counts for a lot in this world. It works for politicians like Ronald Reagan, John F. Kennedy, right? It helps a lot, because human beings, we like to laugh at people and things, and ourselves to a certain extent, if you have the right psychological composition. Fourth, as an editor and leader of an intellectual movement, he was a convener of eccentrics and outliers in the pages of National Review. My favorite examples are figures now that have really passed from a prominent memory, like Erich von Kuhnel-Ledeen, who was a cape-wearing Austrian count and an old-school monarchist and a great stylist. His column, which he wrote for years in every issue, was always great reading. Or another character was Ernest von den Haag, who was the irascible social scientist who could annoy conservatives almost as much as liberals. And I sometimes wonder if Buckley latched onto them because of their names that sounded like characters from a Baroque novel. But Buckley's eclecticism in collecting truly diverse thinkers from different disciplines and different points of view, who often argued with one another in the pages of the magazine, it made the magazine a cornucopia of ideas and thinkers. So it was a big tent, as we like to say these days. And Buckley's first priority was spotting and promoting young talent. The first criteria was writers who could actually write well, and it led him to take a chance and ended up launching the careers of several notable young liberals, like Joan Didion and Gary Wills in particular. Fifth, as a journalist, he had an idiosyncratic style, which I don't recommend that aspiring writers try to imitate closely, except maybe for practice and as a way of experimenting and developing your own style. Now, every newspaper columnist, and he wrote 3 a week for 30 years, I think, every columnist has their own distinctive style, but Buckley broke all of the rules and conventions of the columnist trade. So first, he challenged newspaper readers with a high degree of erudition. He liked to use subordinate clauses that were not strictly necessary to his argument, but which he thought added a certain rhythm to his prose. And I do think that subordinate clauses can serve a useful purpose by slowing down the reader to linger on a point, but it's a device to be used judiciously. He liked to use Latin phrases. I mentioned already ceteris paribus, all things being equal. He also liked to use mutatis mutandis a lot, comparing two or more cases or situations. Now and then he liked to drop in a French phrase too, another language he knew from childhood instruction. And when he wasn't dropping in a Latin phrase, he used a lot of big or obscure words that drove readers to their dictionaries. Terms like tergiversation, not a word you hear a lot in regular conversation, or rhodomontade. One of his favorites was ratiocination, which just means sustained thinking or reflection on a specific thing. I'll note, however, that he seldom used, or I think maybe I'd say never used, a big, long, obscure word simply to be gratuitous or affect an air of intellectual superiority or pretension. Most of the time, I found an attentive reader could usually guess at the meaning of one of his big words from the context it was used, the paragraph it was in. And my own experience was I'd often reach for the dictionary to look up a word, and I'd find it, and usually, most of the time, it was close to what I guessed it meant. So he used it, I like to say, as a teaching tool. I'm not sure if he intended that, but I enjoyed reading his columns as a vocabulary-building exercise, though my high school English teachers were less enthusiastic when I'd borrow his terms for my English class essays. Another important trait of Buckley as a writer that all writers should have is discipline. Like I say, 3 columns a week is a lot. Most columns today do 2. Sometimes even less than that. But at the same time, he was always writing a book or 2, delivering lectures, doing book reviews, editing the magazine, which took a lot of his time. For many years, he made sure he read and signed off on every piece that appeared in the magazine every 2 weeks. He used to, being a man of means, he used to spend about 6 weeks every winter in Switzerland skiing. In Gstaad, but it wasn't vacation. He'd start his morning with 2 hours of writing, and then he would ski in the afternoon. Then he'd return to his typewriter for an hour and a half before dinner, demanding that he compose a minimum of 1,500 words a day. And then dinner was usually a movable feast with friends and famous guests, such as the actors David Niven and Robert Shamor, who also both wintered in the Alps, and the kind of people who use the seasons as verbs, right? There's a final aspect of his journalism to take in, namely that a high proportion of his columns were attacks or critiques not about specific issues, but of other journalists and celebrities and their defective views on an issue. It include Hollywood celebrities, actors, musicians. I think he took after John Lennon a couple of times. Now, it's one thing to go after an elected official. That comes with the territory when you're an elected politician. And every journalist does that, but it's unusual to pick on other writers as relentlessly as Buckley would do. And that was a practice he began in his earliest years in the 50s and continued all the way up to when he gave up column writing. Now, newspaper editors today would frown on all of these traits. They wouldn't like his subordinate clauses, they wouldn't like Latin phrases, they wouldn't like the $5 words from the Oxford English Dictionary, they wouldn't like him picking on other journalists. And I could go through other stylistic traits that he had. One day, that's a while ago now, but it came back to me in composing these thoughts. I was talking to David Brooks of the New York Times, and I forget exactly how this came about, but we got to discussing his frustration with Paul Krugman, who wouldn't be. But he told me that there's an unofficial but strict rule at the Times that we never criticize any fellow columnist at the paper. And that's why you don't ever see the columnists at the Times quarreling with each other directly. And I think that's sort of a general rule, and you just don't do that to other members of the Guild. But Buckley loved to do it. So I'll give you one example of his picking on other writers. Take this opener about novelist Norman Mailer. Quote, "I do not know of anyone whose dismay I personally covet more. Because it is clear from reading the works of Mr. Mailer that only demonstrations of human swinishness are truly pleasing to him. Pleasant people, like those of us on the right wing, drive him mad and leech his genius." It's a fairly typical example of the way Buckley would handle people he wanted to put in his crosshairs. But this leads directly to my 6th aspect of Buckley. He had a talent for friendship with people who were his ideological opponents and frequent targets of his articles. He routinely thrashed the left-leaning, socialist economist John Kenneth Galbraith, both in print and in many public debates they engaged in. And yet, they were friends, and they would go skiing together in Switzerland, and also occasionally here in the United States. He had a cordial friendship with Norman Mailer, after writing the kinds of things like I just shared with you. And he'd like to tease Mailer, though. I forget which book it was where he put in an index entry, and it said, Mailer, Common Norman, page 408. Now, if you looked up, that index entry appeared on page 408. And there appeared in parentheses, "Hi, Norman." Because, you know, he knew the first thing Mailer would do in a bookstore is pick it up and see if he was in the index. So there you go. That's Buckley's style. He used to go to Yankees games with Ira Glasser, who was in those years the head of the ACLU, who Buckley routinely attacked in his columns and in the magazine. Now, what all these figures had in common is they never took Buckley's critiques and humorous jabs personally. They respected serious disagreement and delighted in his exuberant company. And, you know, that was not true of some people. You know, his feud with Gore Vidal was legendary. William Kunstler would never say anything nice about Buckley and declined in several invitations to, you know, have lunch with Buckley or come to some event. They were always rather surly and rude about it. In other words, kind of like things are today, unfortunately. Now, this talent for friendship connects to the seventh important aspect, and that's his generosity and charity, literally in the case of his financial support for many individuals and causes, usually away from public notice. I mean, he operated as something of a one-man foundation, providing financial backing for authors to pursue a promising book project, often making forgivable loans to small and struggling organizations, paying some personal expenses for friends and National Review contributors who were facing financial hardship. And this aspect of Buckley is, of course, connected to his devout Catholic faith, about which one could write an entire book. But one way to appreciate fully his essential generosity toward even his adversaries is to take in as many obituaries. Obituaries, I've tried to write a few. They're hard to write. His obituaries are literary gems, often deeply moving, and some of his very best are tributes about figures he attacked or with whom he never did strike up any kind of friendship. I'll just give you one example of many I could bring up, and it was an obituary for Arthur Schlesinger, the towering liberal historian who died in January of 2007, only a few months before Buckley's own passing. Over the decades, Buckley directed some of his sharpest barbs at Schlesinger, such as, here are two of them. First one, Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s obsessive partisanship has disqualified him as a historian. Or this one's better, it's got a bit of that Buckley wit. I shall always be glad to give publicity to any lapse by Professor Schlesinger into sanity. And do not worry that such a guarantee will heavily mortgage my future time. And much worse. I mean, they had some really sharp and, you know, almost nasty exchanges over the years. And at one point, Schlesinger, who returned the attacks in kind, even sued Buckley for defamation and refused repeated invitations to go on Buckley's TV show. And yet Buckley's obituary opens thus, quote, I always regretted that we didn't become friends because the thousands who succeeded in doing so found friendship with Arthur Schlesinger very rewarding. For one thing, to behold him, to listen to him, observe him, read him, was to coexist with a miracle of sorts. And he never buried some disagreements, but they were always sort of softened and rendered less important than the fact that this was a human being of considerable talent and worth. By the way, that's typical treatment of his ideological adversaries. They're collected in a fine book called A Torch Kept Lit, which I highly recommend to everyone. Eighth and finally, Buckley's direct political influence was enormous. And one overlooked episode of his career was his gonzo and quixotic run for mayor of New York in 1965, which remember is the year after Barry Goldwater lost in a landslide to Lyndon Johnson. And everyone thought that conservatism was at low ebb or possibly finished off. It was an unpromising idea, and Buckley never thought he had any chance to win. And in fact, when asked what he would do if by some fluke he did win, his answer was, I would demand a recount. But it was not really a symbolic or protest candidacy. He ran a real campaign with signs, rallies, advertisements, lots of appearances, and all the usual trappings of a campaign. And his purpose was to raise a banner that the rapid deterioration of America's major cities was not inevitable, but that regnant liberalism was incapable of enacting serious policies to halt rising crime, deteriorating schools, soaring welfare dependency, and a faltering business climate. He did, I think, get about 10% of the vote, which is a pretty strong showing, really, for someone without a real political base or political background. And a decade later, New York fell formally into bankruptcy and had to be bailed out and restructured by Wall Street bankers. 15 years later, New Yorkers reached the end of their rope and elected Rudy Giuliani, who proceeded to enact many of the policies Buckley advocated in 1965, leading to a dramatic turnaround for the city that many people thought impossible, and then, of course, as we know, squandered by Giuliani's successors over the last 15, 20 years. In other words, Buckley was ahead of his time, and his memoir of that campaign, called The Unmaking of a Mayor, is regarded by specialists in urban politics as a classic in the field, still very much worth reading 60 years later. But there's one other aspect of that historic campaign that appears prescient just now. Buckley and his campaign strategists all thought that they were most likely to attract votes from the Upper East Side of Manhattan, where you still had a lot of liberal Republicans lived, and where you sophisticated Democrats might be getting tired of things and might vote for him as a protest vote. But to the surprise of Buckley and his campaign team, both pre-election polls and then the final results found that he drew most of his support from Queens, Staten Island, and other outer borough neighborhoods populated mostly by working class and lower middle class citizens that typically voted for Democrats, but who had less and less patience with liberalism as the 60s wore on. In other words, Buckley had stirred what we now think of as a key part of the Trump coalition. A few years later, in 1970, Buckley's brother James, a successful Wall Street lawyer, won a fluke election to the US Senate from New York, and so now the Buckley family had planted a flag in the real world of politics. He only served one term before being defeated in 1976 by Pat Moynihan, which presented Buckley with a dilemma. He liked Moynihan, and Moynihan was running against her brother, and he did say at the time, this is one election that New Yorkers can't lose for a change. But his political influence extended to two presidents, most significantly Ronald Reagan, but also Richard Nixon to some extent. Nixon didn't like Buckley, or the Buckleyites, as he often derided them in private conversation, but Nixon knew he needed Buckley's support to the extent he could get it, and Nixon took notes assiduously whenever he met with Buckley. And it's now a matter of historical record that it was Buckley, along with Nixon's rival Nelson Rockefeller, who recommended Henry Kissinger to Nixon. Though later, of course, Buckley became a fierce critic of Nixon and Kissinger over détente. So George Will likes to argue, not entirely facetiously, with near syllogistic precision, and Buckley liked syllogisms in his columns, by the way. He argues that Buckley won the Cold War. And it's not quite a syllogism, but the line of reasoning goes as follows. He said, without Bill Buckley, there would have been no National Review. Without National Review, no Goldwater candidacy in 1964 that changed the Republican Party. No Goldwater candidacy, no Reagan presidency in 1980. No Reagan, no end of the Cold War. QED, as the mathematicians say. Now, it's a fanciful or contingent chain of causation, but not entirely ridiculous either. Reagan was a charter subscriber to National Review at its founding in 1955. He and Buckley struck up a friendship in the early 60s and grew close personally. So close personally that Reagan provided Buckley with the private code that would get letters sent to the White House sent straight to Reagan and around the bureaucracy that takes in correspondence, so that Buckley could send letters and thoughts to him directly and promptly. In the end, Buckley wrote more than 40 books, including 10 spy novels, numerous collections of his best columns and articles, 3 memoirs of sailing expeditions that are great yarns, 2 memoirs of what a week in his life was like, which attracted very strange criticisms from his opponents. It sort of brought out the worst in people who didn't like him. He wrote several short books about specific subjects, one on anti-Semitism, one on the fall of the Berlin Wall, and his final book about his friendship with Ronald Reagan. Add to this his countless lectures and debates, including at least one here that I've heard of at Ole Miss, as well as his own TV show on PBS that got some of the highest ratings of any PBS show. Against all logic, I mean, if you showed it to a TV person today from Mars, they'd say, you have to be kidding. This couldn't possibly succeed on television. It's too boring, too slow, not enough motion, not enough excitement. And yet it was done that way. I've lost my last page, I'll improvise. That's fine, I can do that. How do I end this? That's sort of escaping me. I hope you've been partly persuaded by my case about the variety of qualities of the person that may not be replicable for circumstantial reasons and because not many people like him come along from time to time. But I think when we are in the let us now praise famous men mode, which we should be often, he belongs at the high point of anybody's list. So I thank you for all your time, and I'll look forward to your questions. Somebody brave, good. Nobody ever wants to ask the first question ever, right? So you always plant one, but go ahead.
There was something that I think was lost with Buckley, and that was when you tuned into a show, which I never got the ability to do live because I was born after
right.
you went out there. But there was something that was there, almost sitting in on a dinner party. It felt almost as if you were tuning into a conversation maybe you shouldn't sometimes.
Oh, that's good.
And if you have the misfortune of seeing someone like Rachel Maddox who speaks in this sort of ill-minded or broken-tongued prose, then next to her, Buckley was Shakespeare. So who do you see in the current landscape of media and politics who's even somewhat akin to Buckley? I know that some people would like to say that Tucker Carlson is, but I think that's mostly just because he's a wasp. I don't think that he shares too many likenesses with Buckley. So do you think there's hope for someone like him?
I don't know. There's no one, first of all. Second of all, that very interesting characterization, like you're tuning in on a dinner party. I mean, remember that he would have on people that he completely Noam Chomsky he had on. Allen Ginsberg, the famous beat poet. I think he might have had George McGovern on once. He liked to do that. And he's unfailingly polite, and the discussion is very, that never erupted in any kind of brawl or shouting or, cheap point scoring. Victor Navasky had on. Victor Navasky was the very far left editor of The Nation who went to his grave denying that Alger Hiss was guilty. He was framed by Nixon and the FBI, even though the evidence is overwhelming that he was. So, but Buckley always treated him nicely. So he treated people decently, and not all his guests reciprocated fully, but the ones who got it did. And so, nobody does that anymore. And now what people will tell you is it makes for boring television. Now, you're probably too young to know that as recently as the late 1990s, both Fox and MSNBC, which both started in the mid to late 1996, I think, or both, they try to not really much do fire and light, but they try to have panels or pair hosts who are left and right. And both ended up abandoning them for business reasons. The calculation was Fox is for conservatives, MSNBC is for liberals, and their audiences are, MSNBC's is tiny, Fox is much bigger, but still, it's they've decided to give up on the idea of trying to have a balance of views because you don't get as many viewers, and therefore there's not as much revenue, sadly enough. So, so it takes a special kind of person, someone who's well-liked and respected and knows that he will treat you decently and seriously, and then somebody on the other side of the table willing to do the same. It's true in a lot of aspects of life, I think, right? So, I wish I could be more optimistic than that. Yeah, Tucker's a talented guy, but he's got his own shtick, and again, emphasize how ecumenical Buckley was, right? He, if you were sort of vaguely on the right, he would, he would praise you and support you insofar as he agreed, and that doesn't happen now. Now everybody's not everybody, but there's a lot of people who are purists and want to stake out some outrageous ground, and it's unfortunate, I think. Yes, sir.
I'll ask an awkward question about Buckley. Often, one of the discussions in the modern conservative history is on Buckley and race. On the one hand, he gets a lot of praise for disbanding and distancing from anti-Semitism, white nationalism, so trying to minimize and expunge that from the conservative movement, especially around Reagan. But there is the defense of segregation, there is some of the early National Review articles are really bad. Just curious, with that complicated history, where does Buckley fit in that?
Well, I mean, I'm working my way through the forthcoming definitive biography of Sam Tannenhouse that will be out in June. It's 1,000 pages, and I'm maybe 50 pages into it. It's very good. I mean, he's got a lot of stuff in his childhood. He's really gotten stuff that nobody else ever got, I think. And I'm up to the part where he's saying, his family spent half the time, his dad was from Texas, his mom was from South Carolina, spent a lot of time in South Carolina, and yeah, they very much had the conventional views of aristocratic white Southerners, and he fully absorbed those. Now, I'd say this in his defense, two things. One is, some of those articles you read, he makes a case, which I think is not insensible, and especially in light of subsequent history, that, I'll put it this way charitably, to his point, which is the federal government is going to be bad at solving this problem. Wasn't so much a states' rights guy. He didn't really repair behind that old banner, but he thought the federal intervention was not going to be effective, and that the South would make progress on its own if you were patient. And now maybe that you can fault that. Maybe it's naive, but maybe not entirely. I was discussing with some students earlier today about the early work of Gary Becker, who later won the Nobel Prize in behavioral economics. His dissertation in 1956 was the economics of discrimination. And he did a very intense number crunching about all this. And he said, I think that the marketplace is going to erode segregation and discrimination in the South probably by 60%. I forget now how he arrived at that number. I read it a long time ago. By the way, early as the mid-50s, his advisors at Chicago told him not to take up that topic and not to publish that book because it was just so, heterodox. And one of his points was, to sort of update it slightly, was, the South is changing economically and demographically. Northerners are moving there. National companies are moving there. Chains are going to start moving there. So the way he put it later on is McDonald's and Motel 6 and all these national companies who are billed to a standard, and most of them committed to non-discrimination on their own, are they going to want to enforce segregation at their locations in the South? Probably not, unless they're forced to by the law, which is another whole element of all this. And then I always was curious. I knew Becker. I met him a few times, didn't know him well, but I always wanted to ask, well, what about the other 40%? And I'm pretty sure his answer to that would have been, there are some people who are just irrational and are willing to sacrifice profit maximization and having a wider customer base in service of the old prejudices. Now, Buckley did, later in life, regret his opposition and say, yeah, I was wrong about that. You did need federal intervention. We did need civil rights legislation. Even though the growing conventional wisdom among many conservatives now is that, boy, that hasn't worked very well, and I'll just stop there. See Christopher Caldwell's book on the Age of Entitlement, which I think has got some good points and some bad history, but never mind that for now. That's another article for another day. But, and by the way, at the same time, I think it was around, I forget when he first said he was wrong about the Civil Rights Act. I know he did it with Charlie Rose, I'm going to say around 2003 or 2004. At the same time, he said, my other great mistake was supporting the Vietnam War. And at that time, he'd soured on the Iraq War and said, if we had a parliamentary system, George W. Bush would be kicked out of office tomorrow, and deservedly so, he said. This was a bit of a recurrence to his, at the same time that he was sort of absorbing Southern values, I'll put it that way. He was an America Firster. Wanted us to stay out of World War II until we were attacked. But he was very much an isolationist. And he, like a lot of the right today, are returning to home a little bit. And he was an early harbinger of that, I think, in his last decade. Is that helpful a little bit?
No, yeah. Also, he said counts as Holocaust survivors, as was very
yeah.
As well.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Dr. Hayward, it seems with the news we're seeing with the pro-Palestine, anti-Israel protests in the news, that the left is sort of taking up the whole free speech angle nowadays.
Oh.
What is your opinion on free speech absolutism from right or left?
Yeah, that's a great irony. First of all, by the way, this kind of goes to the previous question about civil rights a bit. National Review was indifferent or mildly hostile to Israel in the 1950s. And it was several prominent Jewish subscribers to the magazine who were writing. First, their portal was Wilmore Kendall, who said, well, why are you guys so hard on Israel? It's a conservative country in a small C way, right? It's a pillar of Western civilization, the same tradition as European Christianity. So he softened on that, and the magazine became much more pro-Israel, to the point that after the '67 war, Buckley said, we ought to sign a mutual defense treaty with Israel for our benefit, because they know how to fight, right? Okay. And now, of course, Buckley, one of his earliest books was defending Joe McCarthy, called McCarthy and His Enemies. And makes for curious reading these days. And one of the arguments that Buckley and a lot of other conservatives made was, wait a minute, yeah, we're for free speech and academic freedom, but it can't be absolute. It can't be completely unlimited, and here's why. We ought to be able to, at least in theory, practice is harder, and he admitted that, but at least in theory, we ought to be able to say, does not a democratic country have a right to defend itself against people who would use the right of free speech to cancel democracy and end everybody else's right to free speech if they got power? So that's why we would be constitutionally correct if we banned and limited the Nazi Party or the Communist Party, right? Now you can't have that. Now the shoe's on the other foot. Nowadays, it's conservatives who are championing free speech, partly because there's so many things you can't say on a college campus or anywhere. My joke, by the way, is you'll know wokeness is over when a college fraternity at somewhere like Berkeley could show blazing saddles and not get run out of town, right? That's almost literally true. Anyway, so now the shoe's on the other foot. It's conservatives, and now it's some people on the left who are giving an argument that kind of resembles that earlier one. I mean, their version of hate speech is, if it makes someone feel bad, it's bad for the social fabric, and it's not identical, but it's a similar argument. In other words, there's a metaphysical basis for the idea of free speech at the end. And now, putting that into practice is very difficult. And Buckley slowly came to the view by the mid-'60s that, although that argument he thought was right in theory, our small d democratic reserves in this country are robust enough to put up with communists. And probably Nazis too. I mean, the magazine did run an article, famous article in 1978 when the famous case, the Skokie case, got the Supreme Court. That was the case involving the American Nazi Party that wanted to have a parade in Skokie, Illinois, home of a lot of Holocaust survivors. Why did they pick Skokie? Because they wanted to be maximally offensive to Jews. They could have picked Evanston, Northwestern, no, they picked Skokie. National Review ran an article saying the ACLU, again, completely wrong about this. Skokie is entirely entitled to say, you have free speech, but you can't have it here, because we know what your motive is, and it's not necessary for somebody to actually have an act of violence to constitute an assault. And they lost that argument. The Supreme Court ruled as they do on First Amendment. But so you see that argument was still alive, and there was one test case for it, and people, your mileage may vary, right? I'll stop that there. I go on a long time about the Skokie case, and I'll just say this, the dean of the law school at Berkeley, where I spend a little bit of time, is Erwin Chemerinsky, who's very left. And he's a big defender of old-fashioned ACLU free speech absolutism. And I get to kid him that, Erwin, I'm to the left of you on this question. I say left, right? That I think there are intelligible limits to someone who would trash democracy to gain power and use our own tools against us. And he says, no, we can't do it. Okay, anyway. Someone else? And Shirley, where are you, Shirley? Get the hook out when the time comes. Oh, there you are, okay.
I just wanted to give you a chance to respond to many of the retrospectives that are coming out now about Buckley.
Right.
I believe PBS came out with one, and then there's this big biography coming out. And also people on the conservative side are also kind of looking back at Buckley's legacy and kind of forming new opinions about it. And I just wanted to give you, I'd be interested to hear what aspects of those retrospectives are kind of helpful and maybe illuminating.
Yeah.
But then also, what parts just seem ridiculous to you, or just really misguided in some way?
In my mind, Shirley, one of his final books was a book called Gratitude, What We Owe Our Country. It's great reading. It's short. It's great reading. He doesn't use a lot of big words in it, which is, I don't know what to say about that, but like he did in his columns. You know, it's a very patriotic book about we owe this country a lot. And collaterally, I think, yeah, I get very frustrated with the young conservatives who they don't like Buckley, they don't like Ronald Reagan, and why? Well, they were too nice. I mean, look, for a lot of people, Trump's rudeness is a feature and not a bug, right? And I kind of get that a little bit, but I think they're transporting sort of current atmosphere of things back on an earlier time when, you know, like the atmosphere firing line, as we mentioned. But yeah, the previous question on civil rights, the line of Buckley is he did great things in marginalizing the anti-Semites, which wasn't, well, I won't say it wasn't that hard. There was still the American Mercury and some other anti-Semitic magazines around. And then the John Birch Society, who were, I think, you know, they were a big thing in the 60s, but they never had more than 100,000 members. But they were brilliant at public relations, and the media and people on the left were terrified of them. I think, strangely so. But still, Buckley attacked them, and it cost him a lot of subscribers and donors to the magazine when he did that, but he did it anyway. And so the remaining criticism was sort of suggested in the previous question as well, but he didn't really do much about racists in the Republican Party. And the PBS documentary, it's pretty good until you get to the end, and it ends with January 6th like it's Buckley's fault. You know, he died, what, 15 years before, almost 15 years before. So they're trying to draw a straight line between, and you may know this, no idea of knowing what Buckley would think today, but he did write in, I think, around 2001, because remember, especially younger people here, Trump's been a huge celebrity in New York since the early 80s. And I was, I used to read about this guy, see him on TV, and I always thought he was a buffoon. But Buckley really thought he was a buffoon and wrote a very harsh article about him, I think in 2000 or 2001, because he thought about running for president as early as 2000 on the Reform Party ticket and didn't do it. And I forget where Buckley wrote it, Vanity Fair somewhere, but it was a very savage article about Trump. And it may have been a temperament thing, right? I know a lot of people who love what Trump's doing and just can't stand the man. That's totally comprehensible. He might have been like that. But yeah, I think the young conservatives who don't like him are showing ingratitude and too narrow an understanding of how things happen in this world, how we got here, that we wouldn't have gotten to where they are without him and all the things he's been involved with. And I think under the circumstances, Ronald Reagan was pretty effective at contesting the left. And if he didn't get more things done, well, winning the Cold War was a pretty big deal. And I often have the thought experiment, what would he have done if he hadn't had that to do? He could have concentrated on just domestic, I think a lot more, but who knows? Mackenzie.
Yeah.
Welcome back to class, Mackenzie. I had her in class a year ago or so, right?
So my question, first I'll start, I really liked that story you told about the historian Schlesinger.
Yeah.
And I will say the caveat, I think it's important to be kind, especially to people we disagree with.
Yeah.
But there's also a part of me, I think that ideologically Republicans have lost their teeth after Reagan. In some way, there wasn't as much willingness to fight back, right? It was just more of like a turn the other cheek Romneyism sort of thing. And I wonder, so I guess the first part of my question is, I wonder to what degree did Buckley influence that, which I think at a core is a virtuous thing. And then my second part of the question is, in the current kind of Machiavellian environment that we have today, is it possible to bring that back? And should we bring it back?
Good questions. I don't think, Buckley, I think, was an overlap with George H.W. Bush at Yale and knew him pretty well, but was generally unimpressed with either Bush presidency, as were a lot of people, right? They just didn't get it. They didn't. I say a little about that in my second book is, Bush and Reagan got along fine, as both president, vice president, and as, individuals, but Bush had a very different idea about things. He was much more conventionally establishment Republican. There's a famous, you may not know this story, but when George H.W. Bush was giving his convention acceptance speech in 1988, he says, I want to work for a kinder, gentler America. And Nancy Reagan's sitting in the stands, she's saying, kinder and gentler than who? I mean, she knew what was the subtext of that comment. And So yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the phrase I use is too many Republicans have Stockholm syndrome in Washington. Although, a point to remember about Reagan is when he became president in '81, and Republicans had their first majority in the Senate in 40 years, there were, by my count, 16 liberal Republican senators. In other words, like there are 16 people who are like, today it's Susan Collins is the last one, right? Who's sort of moderate to slightly liberal from Maine. But you had several Republicans much more liberal than Susan Collins. You know, Mac Mathias of Maryland, Chuck Percy of Illinois, both Packwood and Hatfield from Oregon. I can go on down the list. There's more that I'm forgetting. Lowell Weicker of Connecticut, who Reagan in his diary called a no-good pompous fathead. Republican senator, right? So Reagan had to deal with a party that's not nearly as conservative as it is today. The parties were still sorting themselves out there. And often got along great with, in his diary, he often complains about Republicans more than Democrats. He could deal with a number of Democrats, and Republicans were, he complained a lot about freshman Senator Mitch McConnell. Won't back me up on vetoes of big spending bills. So, yeah, so there's a lot to that story, a lot of moving parts. Trump saw a vacuum and filled it, right? There's some fight there. So I think the big question is whether it's J.D. Vance or Ron DeSantis, who I think is a very able guy and pretty smart and seriously conservative, whoever the successor is to Trump, there's going to be nobody like Trump, but whether they're going to have that same sort of aggressive edge to their political bearing, I think, is the big question for Republicans as we go forward from here. My guess is in the short run, certainly yes. We'll have to see what happens. I mean, they may crash and burn. Tariffs may ruin. I'm writing an article right now about Reagan trying to hold the line against tariffs and protectionism, against the bipartisan consensus in favor of protectionism in the 80s. And now you have just the opposite. There's likely a bipartisan consensus, weak probably, but in favor of mostly free trade or liberalized trade, and Trump who's against it. So here's another place of instance of changing places, and we'll see how that plays out. But Trump could crash and burn, and then who knows how the pieces get picked up. One of my favorite things Trump says is, we'll just have to see what happens. I love that when he does that. One more? Oh, there we go. Sure.
So I'm not going to say anything original here, but obviously Protestantism was very influential in the founding period, very influential in American culture.
Would you say Protestantism? Yeah, good. Yeah, okay.
Coming from Europe, that's very obvious.
Right.
And so it's interesting to me that Buckley was a Catholic and had such an influence on the conservative movement. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the influence of Buckley's Catholicism on the conservative movement and the influence of Buckley's conservatism on American Catholicism, if you know anything about that.
Yeah, I think my first pass is it's limited in this way. You could read all the old National Reviews, and it's pretty clear it's a lot of Catholics running the place. Not entirely. He did have a few Protestant writers writing religion columns, but it sort of skewed Catholic. But it was never, you would never have quite called it a Catholic magazine. It was always sort of slightly subdued, right? And he would sometimes criticize Catholic bishops or the Pope and things like that, but that was never front and center. So in other words, he wore that lightly. I mean, he had... I remember he did write one article one time about, I think he had his own private pew in his local Catholic parish, and he said one of the things he hated was the passing of the peace, which many Catholic parishes and Episcopal churches do. He hated that. I have to shake hands with strangers. I don't want to. So it was he was a bashful guy, slightly shy, but I mean he would stand in receiving lines and shake hands at his public events, but it was always kind of out of duty. He wasn't a press of the flesh kind of guy, and as I say, he was sort of shy and bashful a bit. And I think that carried over to some of his professions of faith were always sort of restrained and sort of moderate in their quantity and quality. I'm not sure what else I could add to that. It was obviously very important to him, right? He went to Mass a lot, and he did like, I was thinking aloud here, he was a big fan of John Courtney Murray, the great Catholic Jesuit political philosopher, who wrote one of the great books about the American founding called We Hold These Truths, taken from the Declaration. And by the way, there's an interesting passage, and this gets back to the question about firing line. There's an interesting passage in that book that I still use a lot with everybody. Early in the book, it's a very good account of the founding, and Murray, very Catholic, doesn't try and say, oh, there's a lot of Catholic quotient here, but you read carefully, you sort of can detect it. But early in that book, he says, sometimes the most useful thing to do is to achieve disagreement. And I'll read this passage and I'll stop, and if people say, what do you mean? Just turn on cable news, there's plenty of disagreement, CNN, right? But then he went on to explain, he says, much of the time, I'm paraphrasing here, we talk past each other. We don't really take account of what people are actually saying or what they think. So the result is just increasing confusion. So we don't ever get down to fundamental argument. Or people say, oh, let's reach consensus, which means we find the lowest common denominator. And that's actually not helpful. Maybe necessary for certain practical things, but he says, so achieving disagreement, really understanding deeply the roots of why you disagree is a very valuable thing to do. And I thought Buckley always took that mode to firing line and other interactions he'd have with people, right? And I don't know if that's maybe that's a Thomistic trait, maybe. I mean, I still like, boy, a real slog for non-Catholic students or anybody is Aquinas' method of stating his theorem and the objections to it, the answers to the objections, and it's hard to get used to that, but it's really great once you do, and that's kind of his mode too, I think.
So one more question. We've been doing a long time. Dr. Davidson, if you have a question.
Yeah, thanks. So this is actually kind of tagging off of what you were just talking about in the previous 2 questions ago.
Right.
That, so I have many friends that are not of my same worldview. I value that. I completely value.
You have to if you're teaching a university anywhere. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Yeah. Right.
Until the Freedom Center got here.
Right.
But I'm kind of curious that if you fast forward from Buckley's days with firing line and how he treated people to today, where we've got this polarization that's occurred, where now you have somebody that has the public ear, that's considered credible, that's considered not just completely fringe, that thinks it's okay to sterilize a child and mutilate their genitals.
Yeah.
So if you have somebody like that, and this is going back to Daniel and I were having this conversation just before this, what would you envision Buckley doing, sitting in his meeting with that individual?
He'd probably ask some questions. Well, I've read actually a firing line episode. The first question would be, is there such thing as human nature? That'd be the opening question. And if so, what is it? And if there isn't, why not? What are the limits to how much human nature can be changed? And I think he would end, if he's writing an article reflecting on it, with the famous axiom of the Roman poet Horace, which you may know, which is you can try to expel nature with a pitchfork, but it will come back at you through the window. And I've followed this controversy some. I've written a couple of articles that have gotten me a little bit of trouble. And one of the points making is it's now controversial to say there's such a thing as human nature. There was an episode 4 or 5 years ago where the president of Iowa State, Sally Mason, I think was her name, she made some comment at convocation, welcoming students to campus, about, it's an unfortunate aspect of human nature that we have to be worried about violence and sexual assault and things that we want to be safe on campus. There was such an uproar from students and some faculty that she issued an apology the next day for mentioning human nature. Well, this is insane. And so anyway, I think that's how Buckley would open a dialogue, is like, that's the central question. Really? Is human nature? There are, for those of you who schooled in political philosophy, the problem with science is when we take too seriously the famous line of Bacon that the purpose of science is the conquest of nature for the relief of man's estate. I could say some gamey things here about okay, I won't. I'm going to resist the temptation. So that's where we are, right? Is nature's something to be conquered. And, as C.S. Lewis and numerous other authors put it, you can't conquer nature without at some point trying to conquer human nature, and that's going to be bad. And that applies to lots of things. This question, any form of totalitarianism or utopianism, right? And I think, I'll give just a little bit of my opinion. I think we've already got some social science data that suggests, and a lot of it's been suppressed, as you may know if you follow this, right, in journals and so forth, or that the data that supports it is bad and doctored and so forth. But we're already seeing that instead of curing the depression and confusion young people might have, it makes it worse. People say, if you don't allow, you hear this like, if you don't allow some person to experiment chemically on their body. This, by the way, usually the same people who are worried about additives in our food, right? But now you're going to take hormones, do all this, and do surgeries, and right? And if you don't let them do it, they're going to be suicidal. I think the data is going to show it's exactly the opposite. I think it already is. And so, my prediction: someday we're going to look back on this period that I hope we're coming out of the same way we now look back on lobotomies for mental illness, just 60, 70 years ago. I don't think anybody does lobotomies anymore. Maybe in very rare instances, but we don't do that anymore. And it used to be almost routine. So that and eugenics, it's going to be as discredited as eugenics, I think. So anyway, there's a happy note to end on. Anyway, thank you all very much for coming. It's been a wonderful visit here to Oxford.